He threw the ledger across the room before she even finished speaking. It hit the wall with a crack that made two ranch hands freeze in the doorway. Silas Varden didn't shout. He didn't have to. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the edge of the table, and his voice came out low and controlled in the way that's always more frightening than a man who yells. "You made a deal," he said, "with my neighbor, on my land, without my name." Lenora Bellamy didn't flinch. She stood in the middle of that rough kitchen, a heavy-set woman with flour still on her apron and her father's leather ledger tucked under one arm, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she's already decided she will not be made small. "I made a deal," she said quietly. "That's going to keep 22 men fed through winter." The two hands in the doorway looked at each other and quietly disappeared. If you've ever been in a room where your work was dismissed before anyone bothered to understand it, if you've ever been judged by what people saw before they knew what you knew, then this story is going to stay with you. Before we go further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with us through every part, because what Lenora does next is something most people never see coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The autumn of 1883 arrived in Montana Territory the way bad news always does, quietly, without warning, and with no intention of leaving soon. The grass on the hillsides around Red Willow Ranch had gone pale and brittle weeks earlier than it should have. The first of its windows were dark. The cattle that hadn't been sold, which meant the cattle that hadn't been sold, were burning through weight faster than Silas Varden could afford, and the cattle that had been sold had gone at prices low enough to make a grown man feel sick. Silas was 41 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life building Red Willow into something worth having. 260 acres. A main house, a bunkhouse, 3 working outbuildings, a grain shed, and a stock pond that didn't dry up even in July. He had inherited a modest piece of it from his father and had expanded it through years of work that left him with a bad knee, 2 fingers that didn't bend right from an old rope accident, and a pride that had become, in the opinion of the few people who knew him well, his most dangerous quality. He had 22 ranch hands who depended on him for their wages and their meals. In a good year, feeding 22 working men was simply a line in the ledger, predictable, manageable, part of the cost of doing business. But 1883 had not been a good year. Cattle prices had fallen in the spring and hadn't recovered. A dry summer had cut into the hay stores. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the woman who had been cooking for the bunkhouse had left to marry a sheep herder in Billings, which meant Silas had been doing something that did not come naturally to him. He had been improvising. Salt pork, more salt pork, beans, hardtack, the occasional pot of something brown and uncertain that the men ate without asking questions, because they were hungry and cold, and questions wouldn't fill their stomachs. 2 of the hands, Garrett, who had been with the ranch 6 years, and a younger man called Dutch, had started talking in the kind of quiet voices men use when they're weighing their options. Not complaining exactly, calculating. Silas knew the difference. He had been sitting with that knowledge for 3 weeks when he wrote the letter to the placement agency in Billings. He asked for a woman who could cook. He offered a wage, room in the main house, and what the letter described, in his careful, spare handwriting, as a practical arrangement of marriage. He did not offer romance. He did not offer warmth. He offered stability, such as it was, and the chance to be useful in a place that desperately needed usefulness. He half expected no one to answer. Lenora Bellamy answered. She arrived on a Thursday morning on the stage from Miles City, and the first thing Silas noticed about her was that she was not what he had pictured. He hadn't pictured anything specific. If he was honest, he'd been too busy worrying about the creditor's letter, sitting on his desk, to spend much time imagining the woman who might respond to his advertisement. But he had some vague, unexamined expectation, and Lenora Bellamy did not match it. She was 26 years old, with a full, heavy-set figure and dark hair pinned back under a practical bonnet that had seen better days. She carried one small trunk that 2 men could have lifted easily. She stepped down from the stage without assistance, looked around at the hard landscape of the ranch yard, and then looked directly at Silas with a gaze that was steady in a way he found, for reasons he couldn't have articulated, slightly unsettling. "Mr. Varden," she said. "Not a question, Miss Bellamy." He took her trunk. That was essentially the full extent of their introduction. He showed her the kitchen. It was a large, drafty room off the back of the main house, functional but grim, with a cast iron range that had a temperamental firebox and a supply cabinet whose contents Silas described in the apologetic, abbreviated way of a man who already knows the situation is bad. Salt pork, beans, some cornmeal, a small amount of dried beef that had seen better days. Lenora stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at what she had to work with. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she asked one question. "What's that building behind the grain shed?" Silas glanced in the direction. She was looking toward a low, dark structure half hidden by the shed and the slope of the yard. Something had settled in his chest when he saw what she was looking at, a sensation he didn't examine too closely. "Smokehouse," he said. "Old one. Nothing in there but dust and old iron." Lenora said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't quite a challenge. It was the sound those were dark. It was the sound a person makes when they've already started calculating something privately and have decided not to share the results yet. Silas didn't pursue it. He had too many other things to pursue. The first night, Lenora fed 22 men a meal that was still, objectively, salt pork and beans. But something about the way she seasoned it, the way she managed the fire and the timing, produced something that tasted like actual food rather than fuel. Garrett ate 2 plates. Dutch didn't say a word, which, from Dutch, was practically a review. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything to her about it. Over the following days, he watched her work from a careful distance, the distance of a man who tells himself he's simply keeping an eye on things while actually being curious in a way he'd rather not admit. She was efficient in the kitchen, in a manner that suggested she had been doing this work for a long time. Not as a girl helping her mother, but as someone who understood the logic of it, who thought about what she was doing and why. But the kitchen was only part of what she was doing. He caught her twice, walking slowly around the outside of the old smokehouse. The second time, he happened to be crossing the yard, and he stopped. "I told you that building's nothing to concern yourself with," he said. Lenora turned and looked at him with that steady look he was becoming familiar with. "I heard you," she said. "That's not the same as agreeing with me." "No," she said pleasantly. "It isn't." She walked back to the kitchen. Silas stood in the yard with the strange feeling of a man who has just lost an argument without understanding how it happened. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know for another 2 days, was that Lenora had already been inside the smokehouse. She had gone in the second morning before anyone else was up, in the gray hour, before men carrying a lantern and moving carefully through years of accumulated dust and grime. She had examined the firebox. She had tested the vents with her fingers, feeling for airflow. She had pushed against the hanging rods and found them solid. She had looked at the iron racks and seen, beneath the rust, the bones of something that could still function. And then she had gone back to the main house, sat at the kitchen table with a candle and the small, leather-covered ledger she kept in the bottom of her trunk. And she had begun to make calculations. The ledger had belonged to her father. Silas Bellamy had been a butcher in a small town in eastern Montana, and he had been, in the opinion of everyone who had tasted his work, genuinely exceptional at what he did. Not the slaughter, the curing, the preservation, the particular art of turning a carcass into something that could sustain a family through months of brutal cold without spoiling. He had learned from his own father, who had learned from his father before him, and the ledger contained everything. Salt ratios precise enough to account for different cuts and different weights, curing times adjusted for temperature and humidity. The specifics windows were dark, the specific properties of different hardwoods, and what each one gave to the meat during smokings, methods for achieving consistency that most people who ran smokehouses never managed to achieve. Lenora had stood beside those curing tables from the time she was old enough to reach them. She had stirred salt mixtures and monitored fires and asked questions and made mistakes and learned from every single one. When her father died 3 years ago, a sudden thing, heart failure, the kind that doesn't give a man time to say goodbye, the ledger had come to her. She had carried it in the bottom of every trunk she'd packed since then, through every position she'd taken, and every town she'd passed through, the way other women carry photographs or letters. She had never had a space to use what was in it. Every situation had been wrong, too small. No materials, wrong circumstances, employers who didn't want her suggestions, only her labor. She looked at the calculations in front of her. She looked at the window in the direction of the smokehouse. She thought about the remaining beef cattle on the property, the ones that weren't going to be worth selling at current prices, the ones that were going to become a liability once winter set in. She thought about 22 men who had eaten another miserable of salt pork 3 nights running. Then she thought about the creditor's letter she had seen on Silas Varden's desk. She hadn't meant to see it, but she had, and she had sharp eyes and the number at the bottom of it. She began to write a supply list. It took her until the candle burned low, and when she was done, she sat back and looked at what she had written. Hickory wood, specific salt quantities, a few additional tools, nothing extravagant, nothing she couldn't justify. Question was Silas. She had been at Red Willow less than a week, and she had already understood several things about him. He was proud in the particular way of men who have built something with their hands and consider its worth inseparable from their own. He was not cruel, but he was guarded, and his guards had been up so long they had calcified into something he'd probably call practicality. He had brought her here to cook and to keep his household running, and he had a clear image in his head of what that looked like. And it did not include her having opinions about old buildings behind the grain shed. She also knew without particular resentment that he had looked at her the way most people looked at her when she first arrived somewhere. That quick, involuntary assessment, the one that cataloged her size and drew conclusions before she'd said a word. She had lived with that look for most of her adult life. It didn't break her. It had, in fact, made her very precise about the moments she chose to speak and what she said when she did. She folded the supply list and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she went to find Silas. She found him in the barn, which was where he apparently went when he didn't want to be found, doing nothing that particularly needed doing. He was checking tack that didn't need checking. Mr. Varden, she said, I need to talk to you about the smokehouse. He didn't look up. There's nothing to talk about. The beef you're planning to keep through winter, she said. At the rate the cold is coming, and without adequate feed, you're going to lose a significant portion of it to condition before spring. The animals that don't maintain weight aren't going to sell for enough to matter. He did look up then. I know what the beef looks like, he said. Then you know I'm right. She wasn't asking. The smokehouse firebox and vents are sound. The hanging infrastructure is solid. With the right materials, I can cure enough beef to supply your men through winter, reduce your losses, and stretch your provisions further than they've gone so far. Silas set down the tack. He looked at her directly for the first time since that first day, a long measuring look that she met without blinking. You know how to run a smokehouse, he said. The flatness in his voice made it a statement that was nearly a question, and not quite either. My father was a curing master, she said. I learned beside him for 15 years. He was quiet for a moment. The firebox needs, I know what it needs, she said. I've written it out. She offered him the supply list. He took it. He read it. He looked at her again, and something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a man recalibrating something he thought he already had figured out. This is going to cost money I don't have a lot of to spare, he said. It's going to save money you can't afford to lose, she said. Another silence. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and horses, and somewhere outside, one of the hands was calling to another in the yard. I'll order the salt, Silas said finally, the words coming out of him like something being put down that he'd been carrying too long. The wood's going to take a few days. That's fine, Lenora said. I have work to do before it arrives anyway. She took the supply list back, turned, and walked out of the barn. Silas stood there alone for a moment in the quiet. Something had just changed in the operation of his ranch, and he hadn't entirely understood yet how he felt about it. He told himself it was fine. It was practical. If she could do what she said she could do, then it was simply good management. He told himself that. 3 days later, smoke rose above Red Willow Ranch for the first time in nearly a decade. It came up came up slow and steady from the smokehouse wood, and it drifted over the yard, cold morning air in a way that made every single one of the 22 ranch hands stop what they were doing and look. Garrett stood in the bunkhouse doorway with a coffee cup in his hand and said nothing for a long moment. Dutch, beside him, watched the smoke thread up into the pale sky. "Huh," Dutch said, which was more than he usually said. Inside the smokehouse, Swear worked with the careful, methodical attention of someone who understands that this kind of work does not forgive distraction. The first cure was the most critical. The ratios had to be right. The temperature had to hold within a range she monitored constantly. The wood had to be managed precisely. Her father had told her, years ago, that a smokehouse was an argument between fire and patience, and that the patience had to win every single time. She was patient. She was also tired, and her back ached from 2 days of cleaning and prepping the space, and the cold got into the smokehouse in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. There were moments when she stood over the firebox in the gray interior of that old building and wondered quietly and privately if she was making a claim she couldn't fully back up. Then she thought about her father's hands moving over the salt crusts, sure and steady, ivnosdis de dark. She thought about what was written in the ledger she'd propped open on the wooden shelf she'd cleared specifically for this purpose. And she kept working. The first batch came out 7 days later. She brought it to the bunkhouse herself, carrying the tray the way her father had taught her, not showy, not apologetic, simply present. The men were at the table for supper, 22 of them in various states of end-of-day exhaustion, and the smell that came in with her preceded the tray by a full 10 seconds. Garrett looked up. Dutch looked up. An older hand named Calloway, who had been at Red Willow longer than anyone, and had a face like a map of hard country, looked up and did not look back down. She set the tray on the table. The bunkhouse went quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something unexpected happens, not the loud quiet of shock, but the still, attending quiet of men who have been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. They ate, and the bunkhouse stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that means something is good enough that a person doesn't want to interrupt it with talking. Calloway ate until there was nothing left in front of him. Then he looked across the table at Dutch and said, in a voice that carried no expression, because it didn't need to, "That's real food." Dutch nodded once. Garrett looked toward the door where Lenora had been, but she was already gone. In the yard, walking back to the main house in the cold dark, Lenora allowed herself, for exactly 30 seconds, to feel something that was not quite pride, but lived nearby the particular satisfaction of knowing that the thing you believed you could do is in fact the thing you can do. Then she went inside and began planning the second batch. The second batch took 9 days. Lenora had planned for 8, but on the 6th day, the temperature outside dropped faster than she'd accounted for, which changed the airflow through the smokehouse vents in ways that required her to adjust the wood feed and monitor the firebox through most of a very long night. She sat on an overturned crate in the cold interior of that old building, with her father's ledger open across her knees and a lantern beside her, making notes in the margins with a pencil that kept needing to be resharpened, and she did not sleep until close to 4 in the morning. She woke up 2 hours later and went back to check temperature. This was not the romantic version of the story. This was the actual version: cold hands, a back that ached in the specific way of someone who slept sitting up on a wooden crate, and the constant low-level anxiety of a person who has committed to something in front of other people and is now privately reckoning with every variable she might have underestimated. But the batch was good. It was better than good. When she pulled the first cuts from the racks on the 9th day and pressed her thumb into the surface and smelled the result, that deep, settled smell of properly cured meat, hickory dark and firm, she knew it without having to convince herself. Her father had taught her that you always know. The meat tells you. You just have to have spent enough time listening. She brought it to the table again, and again the bunkhouse went quiet in that particular way. This time, though, it was Calloway who spoke first. He set down his fork. He was a man who chose his words the way a person chooses boards for a floor, carefully, one at a time, making sure each one would hold weight before committing to the next. He looked at the plate in front of him and then looked at Lenora, who was standing near the door in the habit she'd developed of not sitting at the table with the hands, partly from instinct, and partly because 22 working men ate fast and she didn't want to be in the way. Mrs. Varden, Calloway said. He had started calling her that after the first week, which was technically accurate, and also, from Calloway, carried a specific weight of acknowledgement. This is as good as anything I've eaten in a bunkhouse in 30 years. The room was quiet in the way of men who don't disagree, but also don't know if they're supposed to say so. 30 years is a long time, Lenora said. It is, Calloway said. I've eaten a lot of bad food in those 30 years. I know the difference. Garrett, 2 seats down, looked like he was considering adding something and then decided the moment didn't need his help. Lenora nodded once, picked up the empty tray, and went back to the smokehouse. She didn't let herself think too much about what Calloway had said. Not because it didn't mean something to her, it meant quite a lot, but because she had learned that way to stay useful was to stay focused, and the smokehouse was not running itself. The supply of hickory was going to need replenishment within the week. She needed to assess the remaining beef and calculate how many more curing cycles were realistic given what they had to work with. Most of its windows were dark, and there was a problem with the third hanging rod from the east wall that she needed to address before it affected the next batch. She was 3 days into the third batch when the smell traveled. She didn't know exactly when it happened, or which direction the wind was moving when it did, but sometime in the middle of that week, a man named Holt, who was the foreman of the Cravens spread about 4 miles east of Red Willow, rode into the yard on a gray horse and asked one of the hands where the smoke was coming from. The hand pointed at the smokehouse. Holt sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the building. Then he asked who was running it. The hand said, and then immediately looked uncertain, the way a person does when they've summarized something accurately but incompletely. Holt got down from his horse. Lenora heard him before she saw him, boots on the hard ground outside the smokehouse door, and then a knock that was polite enough but carried the particular confidence of a man who isn't accustomed to being turned away. She opened the door. The cold outside air hit the warm interior air of the smokehouse and produced a brief fog that she stepped through without thinking, because she'd been doing it every time she opened the door for 2 weeks and had stopped noticing. Holt was a lean, weathered man in his 40s with a hat that had been good 20 years ago. He looked at her with the standard appraisal and got through it fast, which she noted in the way. She noted most things filed away, no particular reaction visible. I'm Holt from the Cravens spread, he said. I could smell hickory from the road. Possible, Lenora said. You're running this operation? I am. He looked past her into the smokehouse, taking in what he could see of the racks and the hanging lines, and the careful arrangement of the interior. His expression shifted in the small, specific way of a man who expected less and is recalibrating. Cravens has got 40 men going into winter, he said. We've been buying our provisions from a supplier in Miles City, but the quality's been inconsistent. Rancid on arrival twice last season, he paused. I'm wondering what kind of arrangement might be possible. Lenora looked at him. For a moment, she thought about the remaining beef. She thought about the supply list she'd been running in her head for the last 3 days. She thought about the number at the bottom of Silas Varden's creditor letter, which she had not forgotten, because Lenora did not forget numbers. Come back in 2 days, she said. I'll have something ready for you to see. Holt nodded, touched his hat, and left. Lenora closed the smokehouse door. She stood in the warm interior for a moment with her hands at her sides, looking at the racks and the carefully arranged cuts and the open ledger on its shelf. She was doing something she rarely allowed herself to do, which was to look at what was in front of her and understand that it might be larger than she had originally planned for. The thing was, she knew she could fill Holt's order. She knew it the way she knew things that came from actual knowledge rather than optimism, specifically, precisely, with a clear understanding of what the variables were. She would need to expand the operation slightly. She would need more salt, more wood, possibly a 4th hanging rod. She would need to adjust the curing schedule to produce 2 output streams rather than 1. All of it was manageable. She had worked through harder logistics beside her father's curing tables on days when the orders backed up, and the temperature refused to cooperate, and everything needed to happen at once. But before any of that could happen, she needed to tell Silas. This was the part she thought about carefully. She had been at Red Willow for just over 3 weeks. She understood Silas Varden better now than she had at the beginning, which was not the same as understanding him well. He was a man who held the idea of his ranch very close to his identity. Red Willow was not a place he owned. It was a place he was, in some deep and structural way, and anything that happened on it was an extension of his judgment and his authority. He had let her start the Smokehouse because the math had been undeniable and because she had presented it to him in a way that was direct without being a confrontation. This was different. This was her, in her third week on his property, having made a business arrangement with a neighbor on the strength of her own judgment, suits without his name attached to it. She knew how that was going to land. She also knew that the arrangement was correct, that it would benefit the ranch, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise to make him more comfortable. She found him at the desk in his office, which was a small room off the main hallway where he retreated in the evenings to work through the paperwork that never entirely disappeared. She knocked on the door frame because the door was open. He looked up. "I need to tell you something," she said. She told him about Holt. She told him about the arrangement she'd offered 2 days to show him a sample, terms to be discussed, nothing committed to yet on either side, but a real possibility. She watched his face while she talked. She'd gotten fairly good at reading him in 3 weeks, which was not the same as being able to predict him. The jaw tightened first, always, when something wasn't what he expected. Then the eyes did a thing where they went slightly flat while he was processing. Then, depending on the situation, either the flatness lifted and he engaged with the information, or it settled in deeper and became the particular closed expression that meant he had decided something and was not currently interested in additional input. She watched the flatness settle. "You told a neighbor," he said, "that Red Willow could fill a provisions order." "I told a neighbor I'd have something for him to see in 2 days," she said. "I haven't agreed to anything on my property," Silas said, "without talking to me first. I'm talking to you now. That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it isn't." She hadn't said it to be difficult. It was simply the truth. "But I had approximately 30 seconds to make a decision while a foreman from a neighboring spread was standing in front of me asking a direct question. I made the decision I thought was right, and I think it was right." Silas stood up from the desk, which he did when he needed to be moving. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. "This ranch has a name," he said. "Red Willow has a reputation in this territory that I've spent years building. When someone rides away from here thinking they've made a deal, that deal carries my name whether I've agreed to it or not." "That's true," Lenora said, "which is why I didn't agree to anything. I offered to show him something worth looking at. What he decides after that is a conversation you should be part of." He turned from the window. "But you've already decided," he said. "In your head. You've already decided this is something we should do." She didn't answer right away, because he was right, and she wasn't going to insult him by pretending otherwise. "I think," she said carefully, "that the Smokehouse has more capacity than we're currently using. I think there's a market within a reasonable distance of this property for what I can produce. And I think Red Willow's financial position right now is such that turning away revenue because of how it was initiated would be a mistake." The room was quiet. Outside, one of the horses in the paddock made a sound, and some further away, someone let a door shut harder than they meant to. Silas looked at her. There was something in his expression in that moment that she hadn't seen before, not anger exactly, and not the closed look she'd been watching for. It was something more complicated than either of those things. Something that looks like a man confronting a situation that is simultaneously frustrating and undeniably reasonable, and finding that combination harder to deal with than straightforward opposition. 2 days, he said finally. 2 days, she said. She turned and went back to the Smokehouse. Silas stood in his office for a long time after she left, not reading the papers on his desk, not doing anything productive, just standing. He had brought a woman to Red Willow because he needed someone to cook. He had given her access to the kitchen, and then, reluctantly, the Smokehouse, because the logic had been sound and the situation desperate. He had told himself it was a practical arrangement, clearly defined with clear limits. The limits kept moving. He wasn't sure, standing in his office in the early dark of a Montana October evening, how he felt about that. He wasn't sure if he was angry or if he was something else that he didn't have a ready name for, something that sat in the chest differently than anger did. less hot, more complicated. He went back to his paperwork. He didn't sleep well. 2 days later, Holt came back. He came alone, which was professional of him, no audience, no pressure, just who wanted to see what he'd smelled on the road and make a decision about it. Lenora met him at the Smokehouse door and showed him inside, which she had never done for anyone before, and walked him through the operation the way her father had walked her through things, not with flourish, simply with precision, naming what everything was and why it was, where it was, and what result each part of the system was designed to produce. Holt asked good questions. She respected him for that. A man who asks specific questions is a man who actually wants to understand, and understanding is always more useful than impression. She showed him the ledger. Not all of it, the proportions and timing, were her father's work and her own. And she wasn't in the habit of giving things away, but enough for him to see that this was a system, not guesswork, that there were ratios and schedules and records of results. Then she gave him a sample. He tasted it without ceremony, standing in the cold yard beside the smokehouse with the sample in one hand. He chewed. He was quiet. "What cut is this?" he asked. He nodded slowly. "Your price?" She named it. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is doing arithmetic and not displeased by the result. "I'd want the first delivery in 6 weeks," he said, "before the hard cold sets in." "That's workable," she said. "Then I think we can come to terms," he said. She put out her hand, and he shook it, and Red Willow Ranch had its first commercial provisions agreement. She went to find Silas immediately. That was not an accident. She went immediately, specifically, because she was not going to let him hear it from someone else, and she was not going to allow the day to end with him not knowing. Whatever his reaction was going to be, she would rather have it in front of her than behind her. He was in the barn. Of course he was in the barn. She was starting to understand that the barn was where Silas went to think, the way some men go to bars, and others go for long rides, and she had decided to find this particular habit more useful than frustrating. "Holt came back," she said. "I know," Silas said. "I saw him ride in." "We've come to terms," she said. "First delivery in 6 weeks. Price I quoted is workable and covers materials with enough margin to count." He looked at her from across the barn. "You shook on it," he said. "I shook on it," she said. "Your name will be on the formal agreement." "My name will be on an agreement," he said, "for a deal you made." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "That's what happened." He turned away and picked up a piece of tack and stood there holding it, not doing anything with it. She recognized this now as what Silas did when he was angry and working not to show it, because he was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that showing his full hand was a form of weakness. "You could have waited," he said. "I could have," she said. "And Holt might have ridden to the next spread down the road." "You don't know that." "No," she said. "I don't. But I know that opportunity in difficult seasons doesn't typically wait for convenient timing." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. "Next time," he said finally, still not looking at her, "you talk to me first." She thought about pushing back. She had the words for it. She'd been forming them in the back of her mind while walking to the barn, the quiet, precise argument for why her judgment had been sound, and why what he was asking amounted to a kind of veto over her competence. She had the words. She chose not to use them, not because she conceded the point, because she was playing a longer game. "All right," she said. She left the barn. Outside, the cold had deepened while she was inside the way it does in October. In Montana, you go into a building when it's merely uncomfortable and come out to discover the temperature has committed to something more serious. She pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward the smokehouse. She had 6 weeks to produce a large enough quantity of properly cured meat to fill a commercial order, maintain the supply for 22 ranch hands, and keep the operation running with the precision the territory provisioner's reputation for quality would require her to sustain. She started making adjustments to the schedule that same afternoon. What followed was 3 weeks that Lenora would later remember not as 3 weeks, but as a sustained physical argument between her intentions and reality. The expanded operation meant longer hours in the smokehouse, which meant more time on her feet in cold air, managing a fire that needed to stay within specific temperature ranges across variable weather conditions. She was waking before the ranch most mornings, and often, the last one, last one inside at night, and the men began to notice in the way that people notice things not with commentary, but with small adjustments. Garrett started leaving, lamplit in the kitchen window when she was still out in the evening. Dutch, who didn't speak unless the situation was genuinely unusual, appeared one afternoon with 2 extra cords of hickory he'd cut without being asked, and stacked them outside the smokehouse door without explanation. She thanked him. He nodded once and walked away. Calloway, for his part, began operating as an unofficial guard of the smokehouse at night, though he would have found the word guard overstated. He just happened to be awake late and happened to walk past the building regularly. And on the 2 occasions when younger hands had gone near it out of curiosity, he had appeared with the particular stillness of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be clear. None of this was sentimentality. These were working men in a difficult season, and Lenora had made their food worth eating. That was the entire transaction, on their end. But it mattered to her in a way she didn't examine too closely, because it was the kind of mattering that could make a person sentimental, and sentimentality in a smokehouse at 4 in the morning when the temperature was dropping and the wood's supply needed attending was not useful. What she hadn't accounted for was Silas watching. He wasn't obvious about it. He was, in fact, very good at doing it in a way that looked like general ranch oversight, a man checking on his operation, moving through the yard and the outbuildings with the deliberate attention of someone responsible for the whole of it. But she noticed. She was good at noticing things. And what she noticed was that Silas Varden moved through his property differently than he had 3 weeks ago. And part of that difference was that his routes now regularly brought him past the smokehouse, and he spent more time in the barn when she was working the morning shift than he had any practical reason to. She didn't address it. She filed it. There was a night in the 3rd week, the 22nd day, of what she was privately calling the expanded operation when something went wrong with the firebox damper. It was close to midnight, and she was alone in the smokehouse doing the last temperature check of the day when she heard the change in the draw, a subtle sound, the kind of thing you only hear, the kind of been listening to a fire long enough to know its normal register. She moved fast, because a damper problem in a smokehouse can cascade into a temperature loss that ruins a batch in under an hour, and she'd had a batch on for 6 days at that point. She was on her knees in front of the firebox, adjusting the mechanism by lantern light when the smokehouse door opened and Silas was there. He took in the situation in about 2 seconds. "What do you need?" he said. "No preamble," she told him. He knelt down beside her without discussion, and she directed him, "Hold this. Brace here. Don't let slips," while she worked the damper mechanism back into alignment. He was strong and he followed directions precisely, which she noted with appreciation, and it took 12 minutes that felt like considerably more. And at the end of it, the draw had corrected itself, and the temperature inside the firebox was climbing back to where it needed to be. They sat back from the firebox on the cold floor of the smokehouse, both of them catching their breath, both smelling heavily of hickory smoke. "Will it hold?" he asked. She checked the mechanism with her fingers. "Yes." He nodded. They were both quiet for a moment. The fire in the firebox was steady now, and the light it threw through the vent gaps was warm and regular, and outside the wind had picked up and was making the kind of noise against the old building's walls that reminds a person they're glad to be inside, something solid. "My father's smokehouse had the same problem with the damper," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It was the kind of thing she'd say to herself in her own head while working a reference point, a way of locating the current situation in a larger map of experience. But she said it out loud. Silas was quiet for a moment. "How'd he fix it?" "Replace the mechanism eventually," she said. "Until then, same as this. Patient attention and a lot of midnight checks." He looked at the firebox. "He taught you all of this." "Most of it," she said. "Some of it I figured out after he was gone." She paused. "He died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Silas said. He said it simply, without the performance some people put into condolences, and she found the simplicity of it easier to receive than the elaborate versions. "He was a good teacher," she said. "He believed the work mattered. Not because of what it was worth, he wasn't a wealthy man, but because of what it did. It fed people, in his mind, that made it worth doing correctly." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "You're doing it correctly." She looked at him. There was nothing elaborate in the way he said it either. He was looking at the firebox, not at her, and the words had come out of him the way the difficult ones usually did, like they'd been considered for a while and then finally just released. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He got up from the floor, brushed the dust from his knees, and said he'd check the damper housing from outside in the morning and see if there was a way to stabilize it better. Then he left. Lenora sat in the smokehouse alone for a while after he was gone. The fire was steady. The temperature was climbing correctly. Outside, the wind was doing what Montana wind does in late October, which is remind you that it is entirely indifferent to your plans. She opened the ledger and made a note about the damper, the adjustment, the time, the corrected temperature, facts, measurements, the record of what happened and what it required. Then, in the margin, in her smaller private handwriting, she wrote 3 words that had nothing to do with the smokehouse and everything to do with what she just understood about the man she'd married. She didn't write them for anyone to read. She wrote them because she needed to put them somewhere outside her own head. Closed the ledger. She stayed until the last check of the night. Everything was stable, and then she went inside and slept better than she had since she arrived. The Cravens order was ready in 5 days ahead of schedule. She didn't make a point of this to Silas. She simply told him the delivery date and the quantity and confirmed the price Holt had agreed to. He listened to all of it, sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the table in front of him in the way he sat when he was trying to stay neutral. And when she finished, he asked 2 practical questions about transport, which she answered. Then he looked at what she had set on his desk beside his coffee cup. It was a single sheet of paper, her own handwriting, not as practiced as it would become, but clear and organized. It showed the cost of materials for the first Cravens order, the revenue from the order, the margin, and below that, in a separate section, a projection for what the next 2 batches would produce if the operation continued on its current schedule. The projection showed a number at the bottom that was not large by some standards, but was, given Red Willow's situation, meaningful. He looked at it for a long time. Lenora waited. "This is accurate," he said. "Conservative," she said. "I projected low on the output and high on the material costs. The real numbers will be better." He looked up at her. Something was happening in his expression that she hadn't quite seen from him before, not the flat calculation of the early weeks, and not the guarded frustration of the barn conversations, but something more raw than either, something that had to do with a man who has been caring for a very long time and has just seen, perhaps for the first time, the possibility of setting it down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need for the next batch?" She told him. He wrote it down. The Cravens' delivery went smoothly in a logistical sense and in a deeply awkward sense in every other way, which was specifically because Silas came with her. She hadn't expected that. She had assumed he would send a hand with the wagon, as ranchers generally did with provisions deliveries. Instead, he appeared in the yard at 5 in the morning when the wagon was being loaded and got up onto the box as if this were always the plan. She sat beside him on the wagon box, and neither of them said anything for the first mile. The delivery went well. Holt was professional, the quantity was correct, and he tasted a sample with the same quiet focus he'd shown in the yard at Red Willow and gave a single nod that meant yes. His men unloaded the wagon efficiently. He shook Silas's hand, and then he shook Lenora's, and he looked at both of them when he said he hoped this was the beginning of a regular arrangement. On the drive back, Silas spoke first. "He shook your hand before he shook mine," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, but the kind that required something from her. He was looking at me when he said he hoped for a regular arrangement," she said. Silas was quiet. "Because he knows who built the thing he just bought," Lenora said. She kept her voice level and without edge. "That's not a criticism of you. Just what happened." Another silence. The horses moved steadily through the cold morning, their breath coming out in regular white puffs that hung in the air for a moment before the wind took them. "I know," Silas said. She looked at him. He was watching the road. "I know what happened," he said again, quieter. "I'm not," he stopped. Started again. "I brought you here to run a kitchen. I know that's what I said. That's what I thought I needed." She waited. "What you've built in that smokehouse," he said, carefully, the words coming with the effortful honesty of a man who doesn't usually say difficult, true things out loud, is not what I expected. And I haven't another pause. I haven't said that. I should have said it before now. Lenora sat with that for a moment. She thought about the rooms she had walked into for most of her adult life. Rooms where people looked at her and subtracted before they added. Where she had to earn twice as what a different-looking woman would have had to earn to be taken at the same value. She thought about walking into Red Willow and seeing the same calculation happen in Silas's eyes on that first Thursday morning in the yard, quick and involuntary and entirely predictable. Thought about sitting on the cold floor of a smokehouse at midnight beside a man who had come in without being asked and knelt down and held the mechanism steady without discussion. "Thank you," she said. The same words she'd said in the smokehouse that night, but carrying more this time. He nodded. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd started with. The earlier silence had been the silence of two people who haven't figured out what they are to each other. This one was something else, less empty. Red Willow came into view on the rise, smoke already beginning to climb from the smokehouse chimney where she'd banked the fire before they left, thin and pale in the morning sky. She looked at it. 3 weeks ago, that building had been an abandoned structure behind a grain shed. Now it had a schedule, a system, a ledger of records. Most of its windows were dark, and a commercial agreement with a neighbor who had already mentioned he might know 2 other foremen who'd be interested in talking. She thought about her father's ledger. She thought about her own, the new one she'd started with her own record of Red Willow's production, separate from his, carrying its own weight. She thought about 22 men eating real food who had been eating miserable food. She thought about the number at the bottom of the sheet she had left on Silas's desk. The wagon rolled into the yard, and she got down without waiting for help, the way she always had, and went straight to the smokehouse to check the fire. Behind her, Silas watched her go. He sat on the wagon box for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he got down and went to find Garrett. Because there was something he needed to discuss about expanding the smokehouse's supply runs, and he wanted someone else to know he was thinking about it as a permanent operations and not a seasonal fix. Because it was becoming clear to him that this was not temporary. What Lenora Bellamy had built was not something you dismantle when spring arrives. What she had built was the future of Red Willow Ranch. And somewhere on the road between this property and the Craven Spread, Silas Varden had finally started to understand that. Garrett heard about the second inquiry before Silas did, which was not the way things usually worked at Red Willow, and which told Garrett something he filed away without comment. The man who rode in was named Pearsall, and he came from a spread up near the northern range that was larger than Craven's, and had, by reputation, more complicated provisioning needs. He wasn't a foreman. He introduced himself to the hand, who met him at the fence line as a purchasing agent, which was a term that didn't get used much in Smart's part of Montana Territory, and which immediately signaled that he worked for an operation organized enough to have specialized roles. Garrett went to find Lenora before he went to find Silas. He wasn't entirely sure why he made that choice in that order, except that Pearsall had asked specifically for whoever was running the smokehouse, and that was not Silas. He found her inside, managing the third hanging cycle of what was now a continuous operation that ran in overlapping stages, and he told her what was waiting in the yard. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished adjusting the position of the cut she was working with, checked the temperature gauge she'd rigged from material Silas had ordered at her request, and then wiped her hands on her work apron and walked out to meet Pearsall. Silas found out 20 minutes later from Dutch, who had been watching from the fence line with the particular neutral attention Dutch brought to most situations. "There's a purchasing agent talking to your wife," Dutch said. Silas set down what he was holding. By the time he got to the yard, the conversation was already substantive. Pearsall was a precise, compact man with a leather satchel and the kind of organized manner that suggested he had done this specific thing, evaluate a provisions operation many times before. He had his notebook out. He was asking Lenora about output capacity, which she was answering in numbers that Silas had not heard her use before, numbers that were larger than what he'd understood the current operation to be running at. He stopped at the edge of the conversation and listened. She wasn't performing for Pearsall. That was the first thing he noticed. She wasn't trying to impress him or manage his impression of her. She was answering his questions with the same flat precision she brought to everything she did. No inflation, no softening, no hedging where she knew the answer, and no pretending where she didn't. When Pearsall asked about scaling output for a larger contract, she told him what it would require and what the timeline would be and where the realistic limits were, and she said the word limit without apology, which Silas knew from experience most people in a sales situation avoid. Pearsall liked it. Silas could see that in the way the man's pen moved faster when he was interested, slower when he was being polite. "I'd want to see the operation," Pearsall said. "Of course," Lenora said, and she turned and walked toward the smokehouse, and Silas fell into step beside her, because there was no graceful way not to. Pearsall noticed this, said nothing, and followed. Inside the smoke, the atmosphere was warm and close, and smelled of hickory and salts, and the particular settled smell that Silas had come to associate with the building since Lenora had started working it not unpleasant, nothing like the neglected darkness it had held before. She walked Pearsall through it, the same way except she'd walked Holt through it, thoroughly, because Pearsall's questions were more thorough, and she matched the level of detail the situation required. She showed him the scheduling system. She developed a chart on the wall above the record shelf, handwritten, showing which cuts were at what stage of which cycle and when each would be ready. She showed him the temperature records, the Zolthian. She showed him the adjustments she'd made to the damper system after the problem crammed 3 weeks ago, the way she'd reinforced the mechanism with materials Silas had sourced, the additional monitoring she'd built in as a result. "You document failures," Pearsall observed. "I document everything," she said. "Failures especially. They're more instructive than successes." He wrote something down. Silas stood near the door and said very little. Not because he had nothing to say, he had questions, actually. Legitimate operational questions that any owner would have about a third-party evaluation of his property. But because he was watching Pearsall watch Lenora and understanding something that sat in his chest uncomfortably. This man was not evaluating Red Willow Ranch. He was evaluating Lenora. He was deciding whether what she had built was worth contracting with, and the ranch, the land, the history, the name Silas had spent 2 decades constructing was largely incidental to that evaluation. Pearsall asked to see the ledger. Lenora looked at him for a moment, in the way she looked at people when she was deciding something. Then she took the ledger from the shelf and opened it to the Red Willow, records not the early pages with her father's work, which she kept separate in her mind even if the physical book was continuous, and set it on the shelf in front of him. He read carefully. He turned pages. He went back to something he'd passed and read it again. "This is your father's system," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The foundation of it," she said. "I've adapted it. Weather conditions here are different from where he worked. The available hardwoods are different. The cuts I'm working with aren't always what I'd choose if I were ordering stock specifically for curing. But the methodology is yours now." "It's mine," she said. Pearsall closed the ledger and handed it back to her with the care of a man who understands the difference between a business record and a document that means more than its contents. "I'd like to discuss terms," he said. He looked at Silas. "Both of you." They stood in the cold yard outside the smokehouse, and Pearsall laid out what his operation was looking for. It was larger than anything Lenora had projected in the sheet she'd left on Silas's desk. Not by an overwhelming margin, but by enough that she felt the number settle in her, like a stone dropped in, still water, the ripples moving outward. She looked at Silas. He was doing arithmetic in his head. She could see it, the same arithmetic she was doing. Most of its windows were dark, and his expression was doing the thing it did when the numbers were better than he expected, and he didn't want to let that show yet. "We'd need time to consider the terms," Silas said. "Of course," Pearsall said. He named a date 2 days away, and said he'd send written terms before then. After he left, Silas and Lenora stood in the yard, and the silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of conversation. "How much of that can you actually produce?" he asked finally. "Most of it," she said. "Not all of it, not at current capacity. I'd need the expansion I mentioned last week." "You mentioned it once," he said. "And you didn't say no," she said. "I took that as you thinking about it." He looked at her sideways in a way that might, from another man, have been the beginning of a smile. "The 4th hanging rod, and a larger firebox hood," she said, "and about 40 additional square feet of curing space on the east side. which the building can accommodate if the old wall is extended. I've measured it. He was quiet. You measured it, he said. 3 weeks ago, she said, before the Cravens conversation. Stood there absorbing this, the fact that she had been thinking 3 moves ahead before he'd agreed to the first move. How long have you been planning for this? He asked. She looked at him directly. Since I walked into that smokehouse the second morning I was here, she said. I saw what it could be. I didn't know if you'd let me try. I planned for the possibility that you would. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture she'd catalogued as the thing he did when he was recalibrating something significant. I'll talk to the hands about the extension, he said. She nodded. The written terms should tell us whether the numbers justify the material's cost. I'd want to review every condition before we commit. So would I, he said. And then, because it was true and because the moment required it, I'd want you in that conversation. She held his look for a moment. I'd expect to be, she said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of where things had arrived quietly and without ceremony in the 6 weeks since she'd handed him a supply list in a drafty kitchen. And Silas Varden, who was many things but was not, when it came to the fundamental question, a stupid man, heard it for what it was. He nodded. He went to find Garrett. The written terms arrived the next afternoon by rider. Lenora read them at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she forgot to drink. Silas read them across from her with his elbows on the table and a line between his brows that appeared when he was reading something that required serious attention. Most of it's dark. They read in silence and then they talked, and the talking was the kind that happens between people who are both paying attention and both have something to contribute, which was if its windows were dark, which was a different kind of conversation than the ones they'd had in the barn and the office in the first weeks. There were 3 conditions she pushed back on. One was a delivery schedule she considered unrealistic given Montana's winter road conditions. One was a quality guarantee clause that she found acceptable in principle, but too vague in language. She rewrote it in terms that were specific to the variables she actually controlled and therefore could actually guarantee. The third was a price adjustment trigger that she objected to on the grounds that it was one-directional, allowing the buyer to reduce the price on quality disputes but providing no mechanism for the seller to address disputes about payment timing. Watched her rewrite the third clause. He was quiet for a moment. You've read contracts before. I've had reasons to, she said. She didn't expand on that, and he didn't push, but the information sat between them another room in her history he hadn't known to look for. The revised terms went back to Pearsall the following morning. He accepted them with 2 minor modifications, both of which she found reasonable. The deal was signed with Silas' name and Lenora's name beside each other on the agreement, because Pearsall's written terms had named both of them from the start, which was his professional acknowledgement of what he'd seen in that smokehouse, that this operation had 2 principals, one of whom held the land and one of whom held the knowledge that made the land worth contracting with. Silas looked at the page with both names on it for a moment before he signed. He signed without comment. Lenora signed after him, and she thought of her father, briefly and with the specific grief that comes and goes rather than the kind that stays, and then she set down the pen and moved on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing. The expansion of the smokehouse began the following week. It was not a smooth process. Garrett organized the hands for the construction work on their off shifts, which required a negotiation with the men about time and compensation that Silas handled badly on the first attempt, and so better on the second. After Lenora told him privately that he'd framed the first conversation as a demand when the situation called for something closer to a request. He listened to this with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being told he's handled something badly, but cannot honestly dispute the assessment. The second conversation with the hands went better. 3 men volunteered without any additional discussion. The east wall extension took 11 days, which was 4 days longer than estimated, because the ground along the east side of the building was harder than expected, and because one of the older wallboards turned out to be rotted through in a way that only became apparent once they started working and required replacing from the base ups. This was the actual texture of construction work, unexpected complications, materials that don't behave as predicted, timelines that slide. Lenora adjusted her scheduling around the construction. She didn't complain about it. She adapted the curing cycles to use the undisturbed sections of Camp's Smokehouse while the east wall was being worked on, which required more precision than her normal schedule and meant less sleep for a week. On the 10th day of construction, Calloway appeared at her elbow in the early morning while she was checking the temperature cycle and said, without preamble, "You need to sleep." She looked at him. "I'm sleeping." "You're sleeping 3 hours and calling it sleeping," he said. "I've been watching the light in your window." She opened her mouth and he held up one hand, a slow and deliberate gesture. "I'm not telling you how to do your work," he said. "I'm telling you that a person who doesn't sleep makes mistakes, and mistakes in a smokehouse cost more than the time the sleep would have cost. That's a practical statement, not a sentimental one." She closed her mouth. "Fine," she said. "Good," he said, and walked away. She slept 5 hours that night, which was not 8 but was better than 3, and she did not make any mistakes. The extension was finished on a Tuesday. It wasn't beautiful work. The new section was visible as new wood against weathered old board, and the transition between the old roofline and the extended roof showed the seam of the work clearly, but it was solid. She walked through it alone on the first morning, pressing her hands to the new walls, checking airflow, standing in the middle of it, and mapping out in her head where the new hanging infrastructure would go and how the additional space would integrate with the existing curing cycles. It was more than she'd had. It was enough for what Pearsall needed. She went back to the house and wrote out the new schedule in the ledger. That was the week the letter arrived from the territorial provisioner. She heard about it from Silas, who came into the kitchen at midday, not the time he usually appeared, and set an envelope on the table in front of her with a look she couldn't immediately read. "This came in the morning mail," he said. She picked it up. The return address was a provisioner's office in the territorial capital. She had heard the name. Anyone in this region who dealt in provisions had heard the name, and the hearing of it produced a physical sensation somewhere between recognition and alarm. She read the letter. It was formal and brief in the way of men who have a great deal of business and economize their language accordingly. Provisioner's name was Aldous Crane, and the letter stated that he had heard of the Red Willow operation through what it described as several independent sources. Most of its windows were dark, and that he would be traveling through the region in 3 weeks' time and wished to make an appointment to visit the property. She set the letter down. Silas was watching her. "You know who he is," he said. "I know who he is," she said. "Several independent sources," Silas said. "In 3 weeks. Holt talked," she said. "And whoever Holt talked to talked. That's how provisioning networks work. Information moves faster than wagons. Crane supplies 3 northern outfits," Silas said. "Minimum. Maybe more. 5, she said. "The 3 northern ones and 2 operations further east that most people don't know about because they're newer." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "My father knew people," she said, and Crane's name came up more than once. I paid attention. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, there was the regular sound of the ranch in midday operation: horses, voices, the distant sound of someone working at the grain shed, and it all sounded very normal against the particular abnormality of what was sitting on the table between them. "If he comes here," Silas said carefully, "and we can't meet what he's looking for, we won't try to meet what we can't deliver," she said. "I'd rather lose the contract before it's offered than fail to fulfill it after." "That's not what I'm worried about," Silas said. She waited. "I'm worried," he said, "about you walking into that conversation and having him decide what you are before you've had a chance to show him." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and held them, which he had not always done in the earlier weeks. "That's happened to you before," he said. "People deciding before they know." It was not comfortable for him to say. She could see that the slight stiffness of it, the effort behind the plain words. He was not a man who talked about things like this naturally. The fact that he was doing it anyway was a kind of information. "It's happened most of my life," she said. "I've managed." "I know you have," he said. "I'm saying," he stopped. Started again. "I'm saying that when Crane comes here, I want it clear from the beginning, to him and to anyone else, that this operation is yours, that I'm here as the landowner, and you are here as the person who runs what's on the land." She sat with that for a moment. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "It's an accurate thing," he said. "I've been slow to say accurate things." She looked down at the letter on the table. Then she looked back up at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and picked up his coffee cup and left the kitchen, and Lenora sat alone with Aldous Crane's letter and the warmth of the kitchen and the distance of the ranch running, and she thought about her father, who had believed that good work finds its own way to the people who can recognize it. Takes longer than it should, she thought. But he wasn't entirely wrong. The 3 weeks before Crane's visit were not easy weeks. The Pearsall deliveries had begun, which meant the Smokehouse was now running a continuous 3-stage operation, curing, smoking, and finishing, all happening simultaneously in different sections, and the management of it required a level of sustained attention that left her genuinely tired in a way she hadn't been since the first weeks of the expanded operation. She was keeping detailed records of every batch, every temperature variation, every adjustment she made and why, because she understood that whatever Crane would want to see, records were going to be part of it. She was also quietly, and without discussing it with Silas, making preparations she considered necessary for the visit itself. She reorganized the interior of the Smokehouse. Not because it was disorganized, her system was functional and she knew it, but because the way a space reads to someone seeing it for the first time is different from the way it reads to the person who built the system, and she wanted what Crane saw when he walked in to be immediately comprehensible without explanation. Schedule chart on the wall went from functional to clear. The record shelf was reorganized, so the most recent documentation was at the front. The ledger, which had lived in a somewhat precarious position on the shelf, got a dedicated space where it sat flat and accessible. She also had a conversation with Garrett. It was a short conversation held in the yard on a morning when Silas was out checking the south fence line with 2 of the hands. She told Garrett that when Crane arrived, the yard and the approach to the Smokehouse should be orderly, not performed, not artificial, just the actual state of a well-run operation. Garrett nodded once and said he'd handle it. He already makes sure it's orderly, Garrett said. I know, she said. I want him to make sure it's orderly the week Crane is here specifically. He nodded again. He understood the distinction. She thought Silas would be annoyed when he found out she'd spoken to Garrett about it, and she was prepared for that conversation. It didn't happen, which meant either Garrett hadn't mentioned it or Silas had heard and decided not to raise it. She suspected the latter. He was getting better at choosing his battles, which was a development she respected, even though she recognized it was partly a response to her own consistent refusal to be moved on the things that mattered. The night before Crane's visit, she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for her. The night before anything significant had always cost her sleep. Going back to the first big order her father had taken when she was 12 years old, and she'd been so worried about every variable that she'd made herself sick. She'd grown out of the stomach sickness, but never entirely out of the wakefulness. She got up at 2 in the morning and went to the Smokehouse, and checked everything she already knew was fine. Then she sat on the crate by the firebox, the same crate she'd sat on during that first long night 3 months ago, and opened the ledger in her lap and read back through what was there. 41 recorded batches. Temperature logs going back to the first day the Smokehouse fired. Adjustment notes. Failure records, and what they'd produced in terms of learning. Craven's agreement. The Pearsall contract. A small notation in the margin from the night of the damper problem. In her smaller handwriting, she read all of it. It was still hers. All of it was still hers. And it was also more than hers. Now it was documented, verified, auditable, the kind of record that doesn't require anyone to take a person's word for what they've done, because the evidence is right there, in sequential order, with dates and quantities and outcomes. Her father had kept records the same way. Every day, whether anything unusual happened or not. She thought about him, sitting at his curing table. In the early morning, the ledger open, his pen moving in the careful way of a man who understood that the record was as important as the work it described. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a smokehouse in Montana Territory at 2 in the morning with that same ledger in her lap and the 2 names on the Pearsall contract and the expansion walls that still smelled of new wood and 22 men who ate real food every day and had stayed through what had shaped up to be a hard beginning to winter. She closed the ledger. She went back to bed and slept 3 hours, which was enough. Crane arrived at 9 in the morning on a gray day, with low clouds that threatened weather, but hadn't committed to it yet. He came in a hired coach with a single assistant, and he was not what Lenora had expected, which she'd recognized immediately as her own mistake for having expected anything specific. He was older than she'd pictured past 60, with the substantial build of a man who had spent decades moving between operations and eating whatever was available along the way, and an unhurried manner that she recognized as the confidence of someone who had no need to perform authority, because he'd had it long enough to be comfortable in it. He wore good clothes that were not flashy. He carried his own notebook. Silas met him in the yard and made the introduction. Crane shook Silas's hand. Then he looked at Lenora. "Mrs. Varden," he said, "I'm told you run the Smokehouse operation." "I do," she said. "I'd like to see it," he said. "All of it. The records particularly." "Of course," she said. She took him inside. Crane went through the smokehouse the way Pearsall had, but slower, and with different questions. Where Pearsall had been interested in capacity and output, Crane was interested in consistency, specifically, how she maintained it. He asked about temperature variation between batches, and she showed him the log. He asked about her hardwood sourcing, and she explained the supply arrangement she'd set up with a woodcutter 3 miles east. He asked about her response to substandard incoming beef, and she walked him through the quality assessment she did on every animal before committing it to the curing process she'd developed after one of the early batches. Showed variation she'd trace back to the input quality rather than the curing. "You rejected beef," he said. "Twice," she said. "The cure doesn't fix poor quality starting material. I'd rather have less output than inconsistent output." He wrote something. He asked to see the ledger. She gave it to him without hesitation, which she had not done with Holt, and had done only partially with Pearsall. She gave it to Crane completely, all of it, including the early pages in her father's handwriting, because she had decided in the smokehouse at 2 in the morning that the ledger was the argument, and withholding parts of it served no purpose. He read for a long time. He read the way she'd hoped someone would eventually read it carefully, going back, cross-referencing entries, pausing at the failure records and their corresponding adjustment notes. When he looked up, he looked at her differently than he had when he walked in. Not with surprise exactly, more like the settling of a confirmation. "Your father taught you this system," he said. "He taught me the foundation," she said. "I've built on it here. You've extended it," Crane said. "This isn't just applied knowledge. The temperature monitoring modifications, the quality assessment process, those are your own development." "They are," she said. He looked back down at the ledger. He was a skilled man. "The best I knew," she said. Crane closed the ledger and held it for a moment, the same way Pearsall had, with the care of someone who can tell the difference between a document and a record that carries the weight of a person's whole history. Then he handed it back. He asked 3 more questions, all specific, all requiring specific answers. She gave them, he wrote. Then he said he'd like to speak with her and Mr. Varden together. They stood in the yard, Crane, Silas, Lenora, and Crane's assistant, who held the satchel and said nothing throughout. And Crane laid out what he was considering. It was larger than Pearsall. It was in terms of what it would mean for Red Willow's financial position, the kind of number that changes a situation rather than improves it. He named a condition. He stated it plainly, the way a man states something he's already decided is non-negotiable. Smokehouse operation would need to be managed by Lenora specifically, not generally by Red Willow Ranch with Lenora's involvement. Specifically by Lenora, with her name attached to the quality guarantee and the conduct productions and the delivery agreements. Silas was quiet. Lenora was quiet. Crane looked at both of them. "The operation I'm looking at," he said, "was built by a specific person using a specific knowledge base, with a specific methodology. I'm contracting with that. I'm not contracting with land." It was the plainest possible version of what Silas had said at the kitchen 3 weeks ago, except it was coming from the outside and it had a contract attached to it. Silas looked at Lenora. She met his eyes. He looked back at Crane. "She'll manage it," he said. "She has been managing it. Her name will be on every document." Crane nodded once, satisfied, the nod of a man whose condition has been accepted. "Then I think we have something to discuss in detail," he said. The detailed discussion took 2 hours. Lenora drove most of it, which Crane came to expect, and Silas had clearly prepared himself to accept. She pushed back on 2 conditions, accepted 3 others with modifications, and held firm on the quality assessment clause she'd developed from the Pearsall negotiation. Crane's assistant wrote quickly. Crane himself watched the negotiation with the attentiveness of a man who is learning something about the person across the table that he hadn't fully known going in. At one point, Silas interjected with a question about transport timing that was a good, practical and specific and relevant. And Lenora immediately incorporated his point into the discussion without breaking stride. The way two people work when they've learned to function as a unit rather than two separate parties trying to coordinate. Crane noticed. He glanced between them and didn't say anything. When the outline of terms was agreed on and Crane's assistant was organizing the notes for the formal document to come, Crane stood and looked at the smokehouse again. 3 months ago, he said, to neither of them in particular, this building wasn't operating. It wasn't, Silas said. Crane nodded slowly. I've been doing this work for 30 years, he said. I've seen operations that took years to reach this level of documentation and consistency. He wasn't looking at either of them now. He was looking at the smokehouse with the expression of a man cataloging something. Not common. He picked up his hat. I'll have the formal terms to you within the week, he said. He shook Silas's hand. He shook Lenora's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake, in the way of someone who is communicating something that doesn't fit into the format of a handshake, but that's what they have available. Your father would have found this satisfying, he said. She wasn't prepared for that. She held it together, because she was good at holding things together in front of people she didn't know. But she felt it go through her in the specific way of something that finds the place you've kept sealed off. He would have, she said, steady, clear, just. Crane nodded and walked to his coach. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and she did not look at Silas, because she didn't want him to see her face right then. She looked at the smokehouse instead, the new east wall still showing its new wood against the chimney with its slow pale thread of smoke rising in the cold gray air. She heard Silas move beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there beside her in the cold, looking at the same building, and the silence between them was not the silence of two people who don't know what to say. It was the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere they didn't entirely expect and are still figuring out what it means, but are, for the moment, content to be there. After a while, she went inside to check the firebox. The temperature was exactly where it needed to be. She made a note in the ledger. Date, time, temperature, status. She noted that Aldous Crane of the Territorial Provisioner's Office had visited and that preliminary terms had been agreed upon and that the formal document would follow. Then, in the margin, in the smaller handwriting she used for things that weren't strictly operational, she wrote, he came. He saw the ledger. He offered the contract. And below that, because it was true, and the ledger was the place where she wrote what was true, Silas said her name would be on every document. She had not expected him to say it without hesitation. She was glad she'd been wrong about that. She closed the ledger, straightened the temperature cord, and went back to the work. Crane's formal terms arrived on a Friday, which was 4 days after he'd driven away from Red Willow in his hired coach, and the document was everything he'd outlined in the yard, plus 3 additional clauses that his assistant had apparently added during the drafting, and that Lenora read 3 times each before she was satisfied she understood what they were doing. 2 of the additional clauses were standard protective language for the provisioner's side of the agreement, the kind of thing that gets added to every contract by a careful legal hand, and that looks more aggressive than it actually is. 3rd was not standard. The 3rd was a clause that named Lenora Bellamy Varden as the designated production manager with sole authority over quality certification, meaning that every shipment going out under the Crane contract would require her signature on the quality documentation before it left the property. Not Silas's signature, hers. She read it a 4th time to make sure she was reading it correctly. Then she set the document on the kitchen table and went to find Silas. He was in the barn, which was the barn, which by now she navigated to as automatically as she navigated to the smokehouse. She handed him the document without preamble and pointed to the 3rd clause. He read it. His jaw did the tightening thing, but she'd gotten good enough at reading him to know this one wasn't directed at her. He was working through the implications the same way she had. And the tightening was the expression of a man processing. Something complicated rather than a man who had decided to object. He put it in the contract, Silas said. He did, she said. Sole authority. He said it quietly, reading the words again. That's not just naming you. He stopped. It's a structural statement, she said. He's not just acknowledging what I do. He's making it a contractual condition that it continues to be what I do. Silas set the document down on the stall rail beside him and stood with his hands loose at his sides, looking at it. How do you feel about it? He asked. It was not the question she'd expected. She'd expected a practical response, a question about implications, about what it meant for the day-to-day operation, about whether any of the other clauses needed revision. Not that question. I think it's right, she said carefully. I think it reflects what's actually true about this operation, and I think Crane put it in the contract because he's a careful man who wants the thing he's paying for to be specifically guaranteed. That's not what I asked, Silas said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who has decided to have a harder conversation than the one that's being offered to him. How do you feel about it? He said again. She was quiet for a moment. I feel like I've been in rooms most of my life, she said slowly, where the work I did was noted and then attributed to the situation around me, rather than to me specifically. She paused. This is a legal document that says it is specifically me. That she stopped. That matters. He nodded. He didn't say anything else, but the nod had weight to it. I want to negotiate the delivery frequency in Section 4, she said, because the moment had reached its natural limit and she was more comfortable in the practical. 3 weeks between deliveries in winter isn't realistic if we get heavy snow in January. I know, he said. Let's sit down with it tonight. They sat down with it that evening, at the kitchen table, after the hands had eaten and the house had gone quiet, with the document between them and 2 cups of coffee that got cold while they worked through every clause. Silas had opinions about the pricing structure in Section 2 and about the force majeure language, which was too narrow. Lenora had the delivery frequency concern and a question about what happened to the quality certification clause in the event that she was incapacitated. A practical question, the kind a person asks when they are thinking ahead rather than avoiding an uncomfortable topic. Silas stopped when she raised that one. If something happened to you, he said, the contract fails, which means we need a provision for it, she said. A named alternate who can certify under my supervision until I'm able to resume, or a specified period for renegotiation. He was quiet. That's a practical problem, she said. I know it is, he said. I'm thinking about who we'd name. They thought about it together, which was itself a small, significant thing, 2 people thinking about the future of the same operation as a shared problem rather than adjacent problems. They landed on Callaway, which surprised her slightly until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. Callaway had been watching the operation with more than casual interest for months. He was methodical, he was observant, and he had the specific quality of a person who doesn't pretend to know more than they do, which, in a quality certification context, was more valuable than someone who was confident beyond their competence. He'd need training, she said. He'd do it, Silas said. He doesn't do things he's not willing to do completely. She nodded. I'll talk to him. After we send the revised terms, he said. She looked at him. Together, he said. We send it together. Both names on the cover letter. She picked up her pen and drew a line through a clause in Section 4 and began writing the proposed revision in the margin. And the kitchen was warm and quiet, and outside the wind was doing what it always did at this point in November, which was remind the territory that winter had arrived and was not leaving. The revised terms went back to Crane on Monday. He accepted them by Thursday, with one small modification to the force majeure language that Lenora found reasonable and Silas found slightly annoying but acceptable. The final document came back the following week, and they signed it at the kitchen table, same as they'd sat to negotiate it, and Silas watched Lenora sign her name on the quality certification line and didn't say anything, but had the look of a man who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and is only now beginning to take in the surroundings. The first Crane delivery was set for 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, Lenora ran the Smokehouse at a level of sustained intensity that she would later look back on as the hardest and most satisfying period of work she had ever done. Crane order was larger than anything she'd managed before, which meant The continuous three-stage operation she'd developed for Pearsall had to be expanded into something more like 4 overlapping stages, each at a different point in the curing cycle, with temperature management across all of them simultaneously. Started training Calloway in the 3rd week. She hadn't told him what it was for initially. She'd asked him, on a cold morning when he was near the smokehouse anyway, if he had any interest in understanding how the operation worked. He'd looked at her with the particular steadiness he brought to most things and said that he supposed he did. So she showed him. She showed him the way her father had shown her, not all at once, not with a lecture, but piece by piece, each piece connected to the next by practical logic rather than abstract instruction. This is why the temperature needs to be here. This is what happens if it drops below this point. This is how you read the record to understand where a batch is in its cycle without having to open the door and check. Calloway learned the way she'd hoped he would, carefully, without rushing, asking questions only when he'd already tried to work out the answer himself, and genuinely couldn't. On the 4th session, she told him why she was showing him. He was quiet for a moment. "You put me in the contract." "Silas and I did," she said, as the named alternate. He looked at the temperature record on the wall, then at the ledger on its shelf, then at her. "I won't need it," he said. "You're not planning to be incapacitated." "No," she said. "But plans have a way of not surviving the things they don't account for." He nodded slowly. "Your father taught you that." "He taught me most things," she said. "Then I'll learn it right," Calloway said. "So I don't need to use it, but I can if I have to." That was the longest conversation she'd had with him in 4 months, which was a significant conversation by Calloway's standards. She went back to the firebox, and he went back to whatever he'd been doing, and neither of them said anything more about it. The first crane delivery went out on a Tuesday morning in the 1st week of December, 2 wagons instead of 1, both loaded by Garrett and 2 other hands, before first light. Silas rode with the delivery personally, which he had done for the Cravens run, and which Lenora had come to understand as his way of being present for things that mattered, not managing them, just attending. She stayed at the smokehouse. The next batch didn't care about the delivery. When Silas came back in the late afternoon, he came directly to the smokehouse without stopping at the house first. She heard his horse in the yard, and then his boots on the ground, and then the specific knock she'd come to recognize as his 2 knocks, firm, a slight pause, then the door. She opened it. He was cold from the ride, his face reddened, his breath still showing in the air, even though he'd been inside for a moment. Crane was there himself, he said. She waited. He tasted everything, Silas said. He had 3 of his people taste separately and write down assessments without talking to each other first. He paused. They all wrote the same word. "What word?" she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression had the quality of a man delivering news he finds, privately, moving not in the sentimental way but in the structural way, the kind of moving that happens when something you hoped would be true turns out to actually be true. "Consistent," he said. She exhaled slowly. He said consistent, Silas said. He'd been in this business 30 years, and consistency was the thing that was rarest, and the thing he'd built his reputation on sourcing. And he wanted me to tell you that. She turned back to the firebox and made an adjustment that didn't strictly need making because she needed something to do with her hands. "Tell him thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very good at steady. "I did," Silas said. "I told him the operation was my wife's, and that consistent was the minimum she'd accept from herself." Turned around. He was looking at her with a direct, slightly uncomfortable expression that meant he'd said something he meant, and was waiting to see what she did with it. She thought about the Thursday morning she'd stepped off the stage from Miles City and looked at a man who had looked at her with the quick, involuntary calculation she'd been reading in people since she was a girl. She thought about the kitchen he'd shown her and the supply cabinet with its miserable contents, and the way he'd said, "Smokehouse is none of your concern," with the confidence of a man who is wrong and hasn't realized it yet. She thought about 4 months between that Thursday and this Tuesday and everything that had happened inside of them. "That's a good thing to have told him," she said. "I thought so," he said. He stayed in the smokehouse for a while, standing near the door while she worked, not talking, just present in the way he'd been present that night, with the damper useful without being intrusive, there without requiring anything. She had come to value this quality in him more than she'd expected to when she arrived, because it was not a common con quality, and she'd been in enough situations to know the difference. After a while, he said, "We paid off the first creditor this week." She looked at him. "The one with the largest balance," he said. The crane payment covered it and left enough for the next 2 supply runs. She set down the temperature rod she'd been holding. She had seen the number in her projection months ago. She had written it down and shown it to him and believed it was achievable. Believing something is achievable and having it actually happen are 2 different experiences, and the second one went through her differently than she'd expected. "How many left?" she said. 2, he said. "At the current rate, both resolved by spring." She nodded. "Lenora," he said. She looked at him. He almost never used her given name. He used Mrs. Varden when he was being formal, and nothing at all most of the rest of the time. "This ranch was 6 months from finished," he said. "I didn't say it to you when you arrived, because I didn't say it to anyone. But it was. I was 6 months from having to sell land or sell cattle at losses I couldn't recover from, and either way the operation would have been smaller than 22 men could work, and most of them would have had to go." She was still. "I brought you here because I needed someone to cook," he said. "I knew that was the wrong way to think about it, about 2 weeks after you arrived. I haven't known how to say that until right now, and I'm probably still not saying it well." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're saying it fine," she said. He nodded. He looked at the firebox. Then he looked back at her. "I don't know how to do this part," he said. He stopped. "We started this as a practical arrangement. I know what it's turned into, and I don't know how to navigate it correctly." "What do you think it's turned into?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls of the smokehouse the way it always did in December, the kind of cold that was indifferent and absolute, and had been happening long before either of them existed, and would go on happening long after. "Something I didn't expect," he said. "Something I didn't think I was capable of at this point. Something I should have been." He stopped again. "Chose differently. Something I should be honest about rather than letting it sit there." She had known. She had known for a while. In the way a person knows things, they're not ready to do anything with cataloged, noted, set aside for a later that might or might not come. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. He looked at her directly. "That's not a response." "No," she said. "It isn't." She thought about what she actually wanted to say, which was not the same exercise as choosing the safe version. "I came here to survive," she said finally. "I came here because I needed a place, and this was a place that needed something I had. I wasn't thinking about anything else." "And now?" he said. Now she said, "I think about Red Willow as mine, not just the smokehouse, the ranch. I think about it in the first-person plural in ways I didn't when I arrived." He held her eyes. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." They stood in the warmth of the smokehouse, with the fire between them and the cold outside, and the particular kind of silence that isn't absence but presence. The presence of 2 people who have arrived at an understanding that doesn't need to be stated in full, because the important part of it has already been communicated. "I should check the second stage," she said. "I know," he said. He left. She checked the second stage, which was fine, and made a note in the ledger, and did not write anything in the margin this time, because what was in the margin was already more than she'd expected to write when she'd started this record, and some things don't need to be set down to be kept. The weeks between the first crane delivery and Christmas were the most stable the ranch had been since before Silas had started losing sleep over the creditor letters. Not easy winter in Montana is not easy regardless of how well provisioned a person is, but stable in the specific way that comes when the structural problems have been addressed, and what's left is simply the work. The work was considerable. Lenora ran the smokehouse through December with the relentlessness of someone who understands that consistency is not a natural state, but an achieved one that requires constant maintenance. She had 4 overlapping curing cycles running by the middle of the month, each at a different stage, each requiring specific attention at specific intervals, and the management of all 4 simultaneously was the most complex operational challenge she'd faced since her father's busiest seasons. She made mistakes, small, the kind that get caught early because the monitoring system is good and the records are detailed, and she corrected them and noted what she'd learned and kept going. Calloway checked in on her twice a week without being asked. Not long visits, Not intrusive, he'd appear at the door. She'd tell him where each batch was in its cycle. He'd ask 2 or 3 questions that revealed how carefully he'd been paying attention to his training, and then he'd leave. He was building the mental map of the operation the way a careful person builds anything slowly, without shortcuts, making sure each piece was solid before moving to the next. Dutch split and stacked additional wood without being asked, which was becoming his standard contribution to the operation. Garrett organized the delivery logistics with an efficiency that she recognized as genuine aptitude rather than mere compliance. The 22 men who had been eating salt, pork, and miserable beans when she arrived were now eating well every night, and the bunkhouse had a different quality to it than the one Silas had described to her in the letter, not just fed, but settled. Men who aren't hungry and aren't worried about whether the ranch is going to fold under them are different men than the ones calculating their options in quiet voices. She noticed this. It mattered to her more than the commercial contracts, if she was being precise about it. 3 days before Christmas, something happened that she hadn't anticipated, which was that Silas came into the kitchen in the early evening with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and set it on the table in front of her and stood there with his hands in his pockets in the way of a man who has done something he's not sure how to follow up. She looked at the parcel. "Christmas isn't until Thursday," she said. "I know," he said. She opened it. It was a ledger. New, good quality, the cover a dark green cloth over board, the pages clean and white, the binding tight, not as worn as her father's, not as carried in the world as the one she'd brought from Miles City. Something different, something new. She turned it over in her hands. "For the operation," Silas said, "your father's book is his. I thought maybe this one should be just Red Willow. Just what you've built here." She ran her thumb along the edge of the pages. Clean, unwritten smell of new paper. "That's a thoughtful thing," she said. "I had the idea about 3 weeks ago," he said. "Garrett helped me get it ordered." She looked up at him. He was watching her. With the expression of a man who is somewhat concerned, he's misjudged the gesture. He hadn't. "Thank you," she said. "And then, because the moment was large enough to hold it, I'll put the first entry in tonight." The relief on his face was visible and brief and very human, and she appreciated it for exactly those reasons. She made the first entry that night, at the kitchen table after he'd gone to bed, with the lamp burning low and the house quiet and the sound of the wind doing what December wind does in Montana. She wrote the date at the top of the first page, and then the current status of all 4 curing cycles, and the temperature records for the day, and the projected completion dates for the next 3 deliveries. Then, at the bottom of the first page, in the smaller handwriting that was for things that weren't strictly operational, she wrote Red Willow Ranch, December 1883. Lenora Bellamy Varden, production. This ledger begins where the work has already arrived. She closed it. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with both ledgers in front of her, her father's worn brown cover and the new green one that smelled of fresh paper and possibility, and she let herself feel the full weight of where she was and how she'd gotten there, which was not a thing she did often, but which the moment seemed to require. Her father had believed in records. He'd believed in them the way other people believe in more abstract things, with a quiet, sustaining conviction that the act of writing down what is true, precisely and without embellishment, is a form of respect for the work itself and for the people who do it. She had believed it because he believed it, initially. Then she had believed it because she had seen it work, had seen the records save her, more than once, from errors of memory and from the temptation to round numbers in directions that were more comfortable than accurate. Now she believed it the way you believe things you've arrived at through your own experience rather than as someone else's teaching. She put both ledgers on the shelf beside each other and went to bed. Christmas at Red Willow was not elaborate. Lenora had not expected it to be, and she had not worked toward it being so, because she had a smokehouse to run and a delivery scheduled for the second week of January, and elaborate was not the point of the season as she understood it. What happened was this. She cooked a meal on Christmas Day that was not a bunkhouse meal. It was something else, the kind of meal that takes most of a day to prepare, and that uses every skill a person has rather than a practical subset of them, and that feeds people in a way that goes beyond the nutritional. The hands ate in the main house that day. All 22 of them crowded around two long tables that Garrett and Dutch had pulled together from wherever they'd been stored, and the meal was the kind that produces a specific quality of silence, the silence of people who have been given something that was worth making. Calloway, at the end, stood up without being asked and said something brief that involved the words Red Willow and grateful and the future, and sat back down, and that was the speech. Silas, who was seated at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door, looked at Lenora across the room. She was standing near the kitchen, still in her work apron, because she had never entirely figured out the transition between cooking a meal and sitting at the table for it, in company. She wasn't quite certain how to locate herself within. He stood up and pulled out the chair beside his. It was a simple gesture, grand one. She crossed the room and sat down. Dutch refilled the closest cups without being asked, and the afternoon settled into itself, and outside the snow that had been threatening for 2 days finally started to fall, and Red Willow Ranch sat in the early dark of Christmas evening, warm and full and solvent, for the first time in longer than Silas could easily name. He was aware of all of this. He was aware of the 22 men and the full tables and the snow and the operational ledgers in the smokehouse that were now 2 instead of 1. And he was aware of the woman beside him who had walked into his yard on a Thursday in October with one small trunk and had done what she'd done. He was also aware of something he hadn't fully reckoned with yet, which was how close it had come to not happening. How close he'd been in those first days, in the barn conversations, in the moment he'd thrown the ledger to being the reason it didn't happen. How much his pride had almost cost him, not just financially, but in the larger sense that's harder to put a number to. He thought about the document on his desk. Not the Crane contract. The other one. The one he'd requested from the county office 2 weeks ago, and that had arrived and that he had not yet done anything with, because he'd been thinking about the right moment and the right way. He thought about whether there was ever a right moment for something like this, or whether you simply did it and let the doing be the argument. He looked at Lenora beside him. She was listening to something Calloway was saying. Most of its windows were dark, her head slightly tilted in the way she had when she was actually paying attention, rather than politely appearing to. And her face had the quality it got in unguarded moments, not soft exactly, but open, the particular openness of a person who is, for this moment, not braced for anything. He had brought her here to keep 22 men fed. He had no adequate way to describe the distance between that and what had actually happened. He didn't try to find one. He just sat with it, the way you sit with things that are larger than language. And outside the snow came down over Red Willow Ranch, in the quiet dark of Christmas evening, and inside the house was full. The document on his desk could wait one more day. He'd decided. Tomorrow he would do what needed to be done, and he would let the act be the words, the way Lenora had taught him, not by telling him, but by demonstrating, consistently, over months, that the most honest version of a thing is almost always the simplest one. He reached for his coffee cup. Beside him, Lenora said something to Calloway that made the old man's face shift in the specific way it shifted when something was actually funny rather than just courteous. And the table around them was loud, with the sounds of 22 men who were fed and warm and employed, and had stopped, somewhere in the last 3 months, calculating their alternatives. Silas looked at his coffee. He would do it tomorrow. He was certain. The document was still on his desk the next morning. Lenora found it by accident, which was not how Silas had planned it. But then very little about the previous 4 months had gone according to anyone's plan, and this was consistent with the general pattern. She had gone into his office to return a pen she'd borrowed 3 days ago and forgotten to give back a small domestic detail, kind that accumulates without notice when 2 people have stopped being strangers and started being something else. And the document was sitting on the corner of the desk, where he'd apparently left it the night before, partially visible beneath the edge of his ranch ledger. The county seal caught her eye first. She recognized it because she'd seen it before, on the Crane contract documents and on the property filing that had come with the original deed transfer when she'd arrived. She set the pen down. She looked at the document without touching it, the way a person looks at something they're not sure they're supposed to see, but that's sitting right there in plain sight. The county seal was on the upper left. Her name was in the second line of text, adjacent to Silas's, separated by the word, and which in a legal document of this kind was not a conjunction so much as a statement of equality. She stepped back from the desk. She stood in the middle of the office for a moment with her hands at her sides and her heart doing something that was not quite steady, and she looked out the window at the yard where two of the hands were moving between the barn and the grain shed in the gray morning light, their breath visible, their movements the regular movements of men who are employed and purposeful. She heard Silas come in from outside, the specific sound of his boots on the floor, the particular way he moved through the house. She had learned the acoustics of his presence, the way you learn the sounds of any place you live long enough to stop consciously hearing them. He appeared in the doorway of the office. He saw her. He saw that she was standing in the middle of the room and not holding the pen she'd come for. His eyes went to the desk, to the document, and then back to her. He said nothing for a moment. "I came to return your pen," she said. "I know," he said. The silence between them had a different quality than most of their silences. This one was the kind that happens when something that has been private is no longer private, and both people are adjusting to the change in atmosphere. "You were going to do it today," she said. "Wasn't quite a question." "Last night," he said. "I was going to do it last night. Then I thought about the timing and decided this morning was better." He paused. "I didn't expect you to see it first. I wasn't looking for it. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Is it filed?" "Not yet," he said. "I need your signature on 2 of the pages before I take it to the county office." He held her gaze. "If you want to sign it." She thought about the Thursday morning she'd arrived. Quick calculation in his eyes that she'd catalogued and set aside. The kitchen with its miserable supplies. The smokehouse with its years of dust. The first night she'd fed 22 men and walked back to the main house in the cold dark and allowed herself 30 seconds of something adjacent to pride. She thought about midnight in the smokehouse with the damper problem and a man kneeling on the cold floor beside her without being asked. She thought about both names on the Crane contract. She thought about a green ledger that smelled of new paper. She thought about her father's hands moving over the salt crusts, sure and steady, and the ledger he'd kept for 30 years that she'd carried in the bottom of every trunk since he died. She thought about what it meant to have your name on land, not just on a contract. On the land itself. "Where do I sign?" she said. Silas crossed to the desk. He opened the document to the correct pages. He knew exactly which ones without having to look, which meant he'd read it many times and set it flat, and handed her the pen she'd come to return. She signed where he indicated. Her handwriting was clear and unhurried, the same on a legal document as it was in the ledger margin, because she wrote this regardless of what she was writing. He signed beside her name. He picked up the document and looked at it for a moment, both names, the county seal, the date. "I'll take it to town this afternoon," he said. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "It should be filed by both of us," she said, "not just delivered by one." He thought about this for exactly the amount of time it deserved, which was not long. "All right," he said. They drove to the county office in the afternoon in the wagon, which was a practical choice because the road was icy in the shaded sections and the wagon was more stable than riding. They sat side by side on the box the same way they'd sat on the Cravens' delivery and the way they'd sat on every drive since, which was close enough to be practical in the cold, and with a quality of ease between them that had arrived so gradually, neither of them had marked the specific moment it began. The county clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked at the document with professional efficiency and then looked up at both of them with a slightly more human attention when he registered what he was looking at. "Co-ownership filing," he said. "That's right," Silas said. The clerk looked at Lenora, then back at Silas, then at the document again with the expression of a man who has processed many routine transactions and is registering that this one is less routine than it appeared. "I'll need verification of both parties," he said, and went through the standard process. And when it was done, and the document was stamped and entered, and the certified copy was handed across the counter, he said, "Red Willow Ranch. That's the operation out east that's been running the provisioning contracts." "That's right," Lenora said. He nodded, and something in his expression shifted. In a way she recognized the specific recalibration of a person who has just connected 2 pieces of information and arrived at a picture more complete than the one they started with. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried a weight it doesn't always carry. She accepted it without comment, and they walked back out to the wagon. On the drive home, neither of them said anything for the first mile, which was not uncomfortable. The certified copy of the deed sat in Lenora's lap because she'd taken it when the clerk handed it across, automatically, the way a person takes hold of something that belongs to them. "How does it feel?" Silas asked. It was the question he'd asked in the office when she'd first seen the document, and she'd deflected it then because she hadn't had the words ready. She had them now, or closer to them, like something that should have been possible all along, she said. And likes of its windows, and like something I didn't let myself expect, because expecting things that don't happen costs more than not expecting them. He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that," he said. "About what it costs a person to spend years lowering what they let themselves expect. I don't know if I fully understood it before." He paused. "I think I was part of the reason you had to do it when you arrived. Not intentionally, but the effect is the same regardless of the intention." She looked at the road ahead of them. "It is," she said, "but the effect of what's happened since is also the same regardless of how it started." He looked at her sideways. "That's generous," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "I don't do generous when I mean accurate. It confuses the record." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a genuine laugh she'd heard from him, which was a short and slightly rusty sound, like something that hadn't been used in a while and was finding its way back. She felt it. She didn't show that she felt it, because some things are better held quietly than displayed, but she felt it in the specific ways you feel something that tells you the territory has shifted in a direction you are, cautiously and without proclamation, glad about. They turned onto the Red Willow Road, and the ranch came into view on the rise the way it always did the buildings. Against the pale winter sky, the smoke from the smokehouse chimney rising steadily in the cold air, the horses in the paddock and the figures of men moving through the yard in the purposeful way of a working operation. She looked at it. Her name was on it now. Not on a contract, not on a delivery agreement, not on a quality certification clause. On the land, on the deed in the county record, on the legal fact of the place itself. She had arrived here with one trunk and her father's and the ledgers and the skills he'd left her and nothing else, and he'd worked every day since with the specific sustaining belief that the work itself was enough, that if she did it correctly and kept the record honestly and held to what she knew, the work would carry her where she needed to go. She had been right. She had also been surprised by things she hadn't let herself expect, which was its own kind of result and not the lesser one. The wagon rolled into the yard, and Garrett appeared to take the horses, which he did without being asked because he'd been doing it since the delivery runs started, and it had become simply what happened. He glanced at the two of them on the wagon box and then at the paper in Lenora's hands with the county seal visible, and his expression did a brief, specific thing before returning to neutral. "Good trip," he said. "Productive," Silas said, and got down from the box. Lenora got down on her own side. She folded the certified copy and put it inside her coat, against her chest, where the warmth of her body would keep it from the cold, and walked directly to the smokehouse to check the afternoon temperature cycle. She heard Garrett say something to Silas behind her. She didn't hear Silas's response, but she heard the quality of it, a low, brief exchange, the kind between men who have worked together long enough to say significant things in very few words. She opened the smokehouse door and went to work. The January delivery to Crane went out on schedule, which required a level of operational precision that January in Montana does not naturally support. The road conditions were what they were. The temperature variation between the interior of the smokehouse and the loading yard created challenges she'd anticipated and had protocols for. Most of its windows were dark, and there was a point 3 days before the delivery date when a cold snap touched outside, low enough that she had to modify the finish stage of the largest batch to account for the change in ambient temperature during transport. She'd built a contingency for this. It was in the new green ledger, 3 pages in the section she'd labeled weather variables, not because she'd expected this specific situation, but because she'd been in enough situations to know that the one you didn't plan for is usually some version of the one you almost planned for. The modification worked. The batch was right. Crane's response to the second delivery, which came back through Silas 10 days after it left, was a single sentence in a letter that also contained the second payment, quality consistent with first delivery. Good. From Aldous Crane, that was an ovation. She put the letter in the green ledger between the weather variables section and the temperature logs, because it was a record, and it belonged with the records. February arrived and did what February in Montana does, which is to make October seem like a pleasant memory. The second creditor payment came due and was met, which left one remaining, and the number on that one was manageable in a way that the original total had not been. Silas showed her the updated accounting at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd negotiated the Crane contract terms, and the numbers on the page were genuinely different from the numbers she'd seen in that letter she'd accidentally read on his desk 4 months ago. Spring, she said. Before spring, he said. If the March delivery goes through, it'll go through, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying that to be reassuring, she said. The batch is on schedule. The weather window for March in this region is historically more stable than January, and I have the contingency protocols in place regardless. It'll go through. I know, he said. I wasn't questioning it. She looked back at the numbers. What happens after the debt is cleared? She said. What do you mean? To the operation, she said. The smokehouse, the contracts. What does the ranch do with the margin once it's not going straight to creditors? He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was actually thinking rather than preparing an answer. I've been thinking about more capacity, he said. The east extension you designed, whether something similar on the north side would be viable. She had thought about the north side. She had thought about it in October and had put it aside, because the primary objective at that point was to demonstrate that the existing operation was viable, and you don't expand before you've proven the base. The north side would give us a fifth stage, she said. That's a meaningful increase in output. Is the demand there? Crane's mentioned 2 additional outfits, she said. He mentioned it in the first meeting and hasn't pressed it since, because he's a careful man who doesn't oversell capacity he's not sure about. If we expand the output, I think he'll make the introduction. Silas nodded slowly. I'd want to be part of that conversation with him, she said. Not after the fact. You'd be in the room, he said. That's not a question anymore. She held his eyes for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. It was not a dramatic exchange. It was Davidson dark. It was 2 people who had arrived at an understanding confirming it in the plain language of practical discussion, which was, in Lenora's view, the most durable kind of confirmation, not the kind that happens in moments of high feeling. Most of its windows were dark, which can be revised when the feeling changes, but the kind that happens when he's simply stated and agreed to in the ordinary course of a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table. She opened the green ledger and began writing notes on the north side expansion. The third creditor payment was made in March, which was earlier than Silas had projected, because the March delivery came with a Crane note that included a modest but genuine bonus for delivery quality and timing, a thing Crane apparently did, rarely enough that his assistant had made a point of mentioning it in a separate line in the cover letter. Silas didn't say anything when he handed Lenora Crane's note. He just handed it to her and watched her read it and watched her face do the thing it did when she received good news. She'd worked hard for not the explosive kind of happiness, but the deep and quiet kind that lives in the body rather than the face, the kind that comes from having bet on yourself and been right. She set the note down. I need to order more hickory, she said. I already did, he said. She looked at him. 3 cords, he said. Arriving Thursday. She felt the corner of her mouth do the thing it sometimes did in unguarded moments. You ordered the right amount, she said. I checked your consumption records first, he said. I'm not going to get it wrong and have you tell me about it. This time she let the smile happen because the moment was small enough and private enough, and the kitchen was empty of anyone who would make more of it than it was. Most of its windows were dark. He looked slightly pleased with himself in a way he was clearly working not to show, which was the most human she'd seen him look since the Christmas table. Spring came the way Montana spring always does, not gently, not all at once, but in a grudging negotiation with winter that takes weeks and never fully resolves itself before May. The snow retreated and the mud arrived, and the mud was, in some ways, a more persistent operational problem than the snow had been, because the delivery roads that had been hard and reliable in January became unreliable in March in ways that required rerouting twice and a conversation with Crane about a 3-day delay that she had, and that he received with professional equanimity. The smokehouse kept running. The 4th stage was fully integrated by April, which meant the operation was producing at a rate she hadn't projected when she'd first drafted the expansion plans. On the night, she sat in the kitchen with a candle and her father's ledger and wrote a supply list that seemed ambitious at the time. It did not seem ambitious now. It seemed like a starting point. She had a conversation with Calloway in April that she had not planned for, but that arrived the way certain conversations arrive out of a silence that had accumulated enough weight to need breaking. She was in the smokehouse on a morning when the light came through the vents differently than usual, which meant the season had shifted enough that she needed to adjust her temperature targets slightly upward. She was making the adjustment and noting it in the green ledger when Calloway appeared in the doorway. She waited. He came in, which he didn't always do. He stood near the wall and looked at the operation, the 4 stages running in their overlapping cycles. The organized schedule chart she'd extended twice since she first drew it, the record shelf with its accumulated documentation. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "When you came here," he said, "that first Thursday, did you know it would come to this?" She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "I saw what the smokehouse could be," she said. "I didn't know if I'd be allowed to try. I planned for the possibility that I would, and tried to be ready if the possibility opened up. But you knew," he said, "what you were carrying, your father's work. You knew what it was worth." "I believed it," she said. "That's not the same as knowing. Knowing comes after." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the schedule chart. 22 men, he said. "Every one of them still here. Every one of them fed." "I know," she said. "Some of them were looking at leaving," he said. "Before you came, I don't know if Silas told you that." "He told me," she said. "Some of it." Dutch was going to go to the Harlan spread by December, Calloway said. He'd already made the inquiry. He didn't go because the food changed and the sense of the place changed, and a man makes different calculations when the place he's in feels like it has a future. She held this information carefully. "Does Dutch know you're telling me this?" she said. "No," Calloway said, "and I'd appreciate it staying that way." "It will," she said. He nodded. He turned to go and then stopped. "My wife died 11 years ago," he said. He said it simply, in the way of a man who has lived with a fact long enough that stating it no longer requires preparation. She was a capable woman, more capable than most people knew, because most people didn't look past what they saw first. He paused. "She would have liked you." He walked out. Lenora stood in the smokehouse alone for a moment. She made a note in the ledger about the temperature adjustment. Then, in the margin, in the smaller handwriting, April. "Calloway told me about Dutch and about his wife." She closed the ledger and went back to work. The conversation with Crane about the North Side expansion happened in May, and Lenora was in the room for all of it, which was no longer something that required stating, but was simply true. Crane came out to Red Willow rather than holding the meeting in town, which she understood as a professional signal a man comes to a place when he considers the place worth coming to. He walked through the current operation with the same methodical attention he'd brought on the first visit, and then he stood in the yard and looked at the north side of the smokehouse building for a long time without speaking. "6th stage capacity," he said finally. "With the north extension, yes," she said. 2 additional stages minimum. "The building footprint supports it, and I've already assessed the structural requirements." He looked at her. "Assessed when February," she said. Something moved across Crane's face that was very close to amusement. The expression of a man who is not surprised by this information and finds that fact itself satisfying. "The 2 additional outfits I mentioned," he said. "I can make the introduction in June if the capacity is confirmed." "How soon do you need the confirmation?" she said. 2 weeks, he said. "You'll have it in 1, she said. Silas, besides her, said nothing. She was aware of him in the specific way. She was always aware of him now, not distractingly, but the way you're aware of something solid nearby, a fixed point that helps you orient. Crane looked at both of them. "Red Willow has become something worth talking about," he said. "I want you to know I'm not in the habit of saying that to ranching operations. Most of them are what they are. This one is doing something different. My wife runs a precise operation," Silas said. He said it without setup, without inflation, the way you state things that are plainly true. Crane nodded. "She does." He picked up his hat. 2 outfits in June. "I'll be in touch." He left. The north side extension was confirmed in 2 weeks and built in 6, which was the same timeline as the east side, except without the rotted board problem, which meant it came in 3 days ahead. Garrett disked windows. Garrett organized the labor again, and this time there was no negotiation about compensation, because the hands had understood for months that what was good for the Smokehouse was good for Red Willow, and what was good for Red Willow was good for their wages and their continued employment. Dutch split and stacked the additional hickory. Calloway oversaw the integration of the new stages into the existing schedule, working from the training Lenora had given him and the notes she'd written out specifically for the expansion. He didn't do it perfectly. There was a calibration issue in the 5th stage during the first week that he caught himself and corrected, and he came to her with it, not to ask for help, but to show her what he'd found and what he'd done about it. She read his notes. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly what I'd have done." "I know," he said. "I checked the ledger." She looked at him. "The February entry," he said. "You noted the ambient temperature effect on the finish stage." "I cross-referenced it." She nodded slowly. "You're ready," she said. He knew what she meant. Not just for the named alternate clause. For the operation itself, for the knowledge of it, the understanding of it as a system rather than a set of tasks. The judgment required to run it rather than simply execute within it. "I'm not trying to take over anything," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm saying the knowledge is yours now. That's worth having regardless of anything else." He thought about this with the deliberateness he brought to everything. "Your father would have been a good teacher," he said. "He was," she said. The June introductions came through Crane, and both were converted to cracks, which pushed the monthly output of the Red Willow Smokehouse to a volume that required Lenora to extend the schedule chart on the wall for the 3rd time. The number was large enough that when she showed it to Silas, he sat with it for a moment before saying anything. "This is a different ranch than the one that was 6 months from finished," he said. "It is," she said. "It's a different ranch than I thought I was capable of building," he said. She looked at him directly. "You built it," she said. "Not alone, but you built it." He held her gaze. "We built it," he said. And the word was not concession. It was the plain statement of a man who has finally found the accurate version of what he wants to say. Summer came to Red Willow, and the days stretched long, and the operation ran, and the deliveries went out and came back as payments, and the last creditor was paid in July, quietly, without ceremony, was appropriate because the debt had been an emergency, and emergencies, when they end, don't require a celebration, only a moment of recognition before the next thing. Silas told her the morning the final payment cleared, came into the kitchen where she was making notes in the green ledger and said it without preamble, because preambles had never been his strong suit and she didn't need them anyway. She set down her pen. She looked at the numbers. She'd been writing the July output figures, the delivery schedule, the material order for August, and she thought about the number at the bottom of the creditor letter she'd seen sit on his desk 9 months ago, the number that had felt like a verdict at the time. "Good," she said. He sat down across from her. "Good," he agreed. They sat there for a moment in the kitchen that she'd walked into 9 months ago and found grim and drafty and stocked with miserable salt pork. The kitchen that was now the room where the ranch's business happened, where the contracts were negotiated and the records reviewed and the decisions made by 2 people who had started as a practical arrangement and had become something not easily named but deeply functional. "I want to talk about next year," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it too." "The 6th stage," she said. "If demand holds, we could add a 7th. There's room on the north side if the extension is designed right. I measured it last week," he said. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man who has learned, slowly and not without difficulty, to think a few moves ahead and finds the habit sits better on him now than it did. "When were you going to tell me?" she said. "I was going to show you the measurements," he said. "Tonight if you had time." She picked up her pen. "Show me now," she said. He got up and retrieved the paper. He'd written the measurements on a rough sketch, not her precision but readable, with numbers in his handwriting along each line, and set it on the table between them, and they leaned over it together in the morning light of the kitchen at Red Willow Ranch, where 22 men were employed and fed, and where the debt was was cleared, and the contracts were signed, and the ledgers were kept in 2 books on a shelf in the smokehouse, one worn and brown and full of a dead man's careful knowledge, and one green and new, and building its own record day by day. Outside, smoke rose from the chimney of the smokehouse in the steady, unhurried way it rose every morning now, not the thin thread of the early weeks, but a full, confident column that had become as much a part of the landscape of Red Willow as the hills behind it and the stock pond that didn't dry up even in July. The hands of its windows were dark. The hands who passed through the yard looked at it the way you look at something that is simply part of where you are, not remarkable, expected. The way good things become when they've been true long enough. Garrett, crossing the yard with a load of equipment, glanced at the smokehouse chimney and didn't break stride. Dutch, splitting wood near the grain shed, didn't look up at it at all, because there was no reason to. The smoke was there. The smoke was always there. The smoke meant the operation was running, and the operation running meant that Red Willow was what it had become. Inside the kitchen, Lenora pointed to a line on Silas's sketch and said the north measurement was slightly off, and he said it wasn't, and she said it was, and he said how would she know without measuring it herself? And she said she'd measured it in February, and had he thought to check his work against hers before bringing it to her, and he said he hadn't thought of that, and she said she could see that. He made a sound that was the laugh again, slightly less rusty than Christmas, more comfortable in itself. She took the sketch and made corrections in the margin in her smaller handwriting, and the morning moved around them in the way mornings move when a place has found its rhythm not perfectly. Never perfectly, because nothing that involves people and weather and livestock and commerce is ever perfectly smooth but sustainably, which is the thing that matters more than smooth and that lasts longer than any single good day. Her father had told her once that the best work is the kind that keeps being needed. Not dramatic work, not work that announces itself, but the steady kind that becomes part of the structure of things, and that people rely on the way they rely on walls and roofs without thinking about it until it's not there. She had thought about that many times in the 9 months at Red Willow. She had thought about it in the smokehouse at midnight, and in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and in the wagon on the road to the Craven's spread, and in the yard when Crane had stood looking at the building that 3 months earlier had been nothing but dust and old iron. She thought about it now, sitting at the kitchen table with Silas' imprecise sketch and her own corrections in the margin and the sound of the ranch outside. Going about the business of a summer, her father had been right. The best work keeps being needed. She had carried his knowledge across the territory in the bottom of a trunk, through every room where people had looked at her and subtracted before they added, through every situation where she had been underestimated and had chosen to demonstrate rather than argue, through the particular loneliness of being capable in places that aren't yet ready to recognize it. She had carried it to a failing ranch in autumn, and she had built it into something that would outlast the season. She had built it into the walls of an expanded smokehouse and the pages of 2 ledgers and the legal language of a deed, beside another name, equal, permanent, recorded in the county office in the same ink as everything else that was true. The work had kept being needed. She was the one who had made it so. That was not everything. It was not the whole of what her life contained, or what it would contain. But it was real, and it was hers, and no one could revise it now. She handed the corrected sketch back to Silas. He looked at her corrections. "You were right about the measurement," he said. He said it without apparent difficulty, which she noted as one of the things that had changed most in 9 months, not his pride, which was still there and was not entirely a bad quality, but his relationship to being wrong, which had become something he could acknowledge without it costing him something he couldn't afford. "I usually am," she said. He looked up at her. She met his eyes with the steadiness that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her on that Thursday morning in the yard when he'd expected someone different and gotten her instead. "I know," he said. Outside, the smoke rose from the chimney of the smokehouse in the clear summer air. Inside, 2 people sat at a kitchen table at Red Willow Ranch, planning the next thing, which was the same as planning the future, which was the same as saying, "We are still here, and we intend to keep being here, and the work that brought us to this moment will be the work that carries us forward." The ledgers were on the shelf in the smokehouse. The deed was in the county record. The smoke was in the air. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was in every way that can be measured, and in several ways that cannot, everything.